drugs, or ideas, what you consume influences who you become. On the Mind and Matter podcast, we learn together from the best scientists and thinkers alive today about how your mind-body reacts to what you feed it. Before starting Mind and Matter, I spent 10 years in academia doing scientific research. I got a Ph.D. in neuroscience where I focused on neuroendocrinology and the neurobiology of behavior, and before that, I specialized in molecular, developmental, and evolutionary genetics. I use my scientific background to help parse and translate the information that guests share on the podcast. In addition to the podcast, I write long-form written content inspired by the show where I integrate what I've learned across episodes. I also have a free weekly newsletter where I provide you with upcoming guests, share links, and provide commentary on scientific studies and research that I'm reading, and more. Visit mindandmatter.substack.com to find all of my content. Okay, hello everyone. This is my first Ask Me Anything style recording. So I have a bunch of questions here I've compiled over the last few weeks from listeners. I'm going to go through these one at a time and answer most of them, all the reasonable ones. I prioritized questions from paid subscribers, but I have a bunch of questions from other people as well. Some of you sent these on social media. Some of you sent them through the website. I am going off the cuff here, so I don't really have anything prepared. I kind of put them in a vague order. The beginning questions are a little more general, focused on me and the podcast, how I do the podcast, how I select guests, a little bit more about me and things like that. And there's a variety of other questions here. It is Ask Me Anything after all, so I got quite a variety. The first part of this I'll make available to everyone, and the full version of this will be available to paid subscribers on my Substack. As always, as with my other content that occasionally goes behind a paywall, if you can't afford a paid subscription, just sign up for the free weekly newsletter at the Mind and Matter Substack. Shoot me an email and let me know, and I'll give you one for free. Okay, so I'm going to go through these one at a time. First question. Can you describe your educational and professional background in depth? What do you think drew you to your interests? What led you to start this podcast? Okay. So, on my Substack and a little bit on the podcast, you hear something about my background. So most people listening or that have listened to the podcast probably know that I have a science background, but you might not know much more than that. So I'll just give you, I guess, a brief-ish overview, and I'll start chronologically. When I was a child, I was always very much drawn to biology and nature. I think when I was a kid, I wanted to be a biologist or maybe like a wildlife filmmaker or something like that. I was obsessed with animals and watching them and, trying to figure out why they did what they did. I was obsessed with nature documentaries as a child. I used to watch, back when Discovery Channel was good in the days of my youth, I used to watch a show called Wild Discovery. I believe that came on every week. I watched every single episode. I used to tape it on VHS tapes before DVDs were a thing. And I used to watch the shows over and over again. So I was always interested in biology and nature. Eventually, obviously, I went to college at some point. So I went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison. By the time I was going into college, I didn't know what I wanted to study in college for my major. I was interested in everything. I was interested in biology and science stuff, but also economics and history. I was interested in philosophy and psychology. I really didn't know what I was going to study for sure, but I was very interested in science. And in my second semester of my first year at the University of Wisconsin, I actually started working in the lab of a very famous evolutionary biologist named Sean B. Carroll. He's actually been on he's been on 2 episodes of the podcast, so you can go check those out. And I had read one of his books, and it got me really interested in evolutionary biology from the perspective of genetics and molecular biology and developmental biology, how animals were constructed and how the process of constructing an animal development could be changed to generate, evolutionary change. So I started working and pretty much just fell in love with that right away. So I pretty much transitioned to studying biology in college. So I majored in neuroscience, I majored in genetics, and also zoology. So I did all 3 of those for my coursework, and I worked in Sean's lab for 4.5 years, every semester and full-time over the summer. So He was an HHMI investigator. They had these like fellowship style things for undergraduates, so I could work full time in the lab, make a little bit of money. And so I got a lot of research experience, and I fell in love with experimental laboratory science. His lab studied evolutionary developmental biology. So this is a subfield of evolutionary biology, which is very much influenced by molecular biology and developmental genetics. And so broadly, the lab is basically looking at how alterations in genes that control the process of development lead to phenotypic change in evolution. So how do new forms get built by tweaking the process of development? If you're interested in evolutionary developmental biology, where new things come from over the process of evolution, and what the real molecular developmental mechanisms are that generate that evolutionary novelty, that's really what that field and that lab have been concerned with. Sean has written a number of really interesting books. The one that I read that got me really interested in that work was called Endless Forms Most Beautiful. So that's by Sean B. Carroll, not Sean M. Carroll, the physicist. Really cool book, lots of vivid imagery, pictures, and really cool science there. So yeah, that was my research focus in college, heavy on the molecular genetic stuff. But I was also interested in neuroscience and behavior. I was always interested in animal behavior, as I mentioned. So naturally, I got interested in the brain through my interest in biology and animal behavior, but also my interest in philosophy of mind and consciousness and things like that. And so long story short, I ended up going into a PhD program in neuroscience immediately after college at Harvard University. I worked in a systems neuroscience lab at the Harvard Medical Campus. It was actually a systems neuroscience lab. So we studied mice, awake behaving mice, right? So we're recording neurons, manipulating neurons in adult, freely moving, and other types of mice. So we're not doing molecular studies, really. We're not looking at things in a petri dish or a test tube. We're looking at animals moving around and looking at the brain literally and manipulating the brain literally while they move around and do stuff. So I used techniques like optogenetic, the use of light in certain ion channels that you can put into specific neurons and cell types in the brain. And you can use those to actually manipulate neural activity while animals are doing things. So for example, I was doing a lot of manipulations of something called AGRP neurons deep within the brain in the hypothalamus. These are neurons that basically control hunger and feeding behavior. So you turn on these neurons, animals will get hungry, look for food, and actually consume it, even if their bellies are full and they just got done eating. And so you can manipulate neurons like that to study things like what neural circuits are doing and how they relate to behavior. You can also image neurons and record neurons in different ways. So this was a lab that was using a lot of calcium imaging and related techniques. So filling certain cells in the brain with fluorescent compounds, which will literally emit fluorescent light when a neuron is active. And you can literally watch through a microscope which neurons are active and how active they are while animals are doing things. The work that I did and the work the lab did more generally had to do with how hunger systems in the brain work and how visual systems in the brain work. We were really interested in how different motivational states change how information is encoded in the brain. So for example, you can look at the same stimulus in the environment. You can point your eyeballs, say, at a plate of food. And when you're really, really hungry, that's going to have a different effect on you than if you eat a big meal and your stomach's full, right? If you're starving, the cheeseburger is going to look very appetizing and appealing. You're going to be very inclined to go and get that. You're going to be very sensitive to the sight and the smell of that food. This relates to how value is encoded by neurons in the brain. If something is very much wanted by you because you're hungry and it's food, it's going to have a high value and it's going to be encoded somehow in the brain. And when you're full and you're not interested in that meal so much anymore, the same exact sensory stimulus now has a lower value. It has less motivational pull on you. And so neurons in your brain are now going to encode the same information in a different fashion. And so we were interested in those types of questions. I studied a lot of behavior in freely moving mice, looking at how hunger systems and the motivation to seek food when you're hungry relates to other motivations, like the motivation to escape a painful or threatening stimulus. And so, organisms constantly have to balance these things in real life, right? There's always potential for threats or predators to jump out at you in the environment. There's always the need to find food, especially if you're hungry, the need to find water, the need to find mates, and so on and so forth. And somehow the brain has to encode all of these things, and different circuits related to different motivations have to sort of be balanced and prioritized in some fashion in order to prioritize what the animal is doing at any given moment, given what the greatest needs are. So, if you've ever watched a nature documentary of, animals in the African savanna during the dry season, right? It's dry, they're starving, they're thirsty. In some cases, they might be on the brink of starvation or dehydration. And so, a wildebeest might walk up to the water and take a drink, even though it can see the crocodiles in the water because the drive for water is just so strong under those conditions. And the brain has to negotiate all of those trade-offs. And that lab, even though it was a neuroscience lab, it was housed inside of the Department of Diabetes, Endocrinology, and Metabolism at the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. So I was also, I was surrounded by a lot of endocrinologists and metabolism people studying things like gut hormones and insulin and, blood sugar and things like that. And then, of course, as a neuroscientist, I was focused a lot on the hypothalamus, which is really a neuroendocrine organ. And so a lot of my PhD work and education was in neuroendocrinology, effectively studying how the hypothalamus responds to and relates to the release of things like gut hormones, leptin, ghrelin, and so forth. Things that are related to hunger and satiety, things that are related to body fat levels, and whether the animal should be storing up energy or expending it to find food. And so I got a lot of really good education, not only in systems neuroscience and sort of the neuroscience of behavior, but also neuroendocrinology and the hormones that regulate the nervous system and other tissues in the body. What drew you to your interest? I think I've partly answered that. I was always interested in nature and in animals and how they work and why they behave the way they do. That sort of naturally led me to want to understand the diversity of animals through the lens of evolution. That was what I did in college, and then sort of the neuroscience, what's going on in the engine, so to speak, to control behavior. That was my PhD work in neuroscience. And you can imagine it's not a big leap from there to a lot of the things that I talk about on the podcast and discuss with people. Things like how different drugs affect perception and behavior, psychoactives, like psychedelics, pharmaceutical medications, and so forth. A lot about the neural basis of different forms of behavior, social behaviors, and feeding behaviors, everything that you hear me talk about. And then I've become even more interested in things like metabolism per se and the effects of hormones on the body. A lot of the diet and nutrition content that you see me talking about today sort of grew naturally out of my technical background. Yeah, but other than that, I'm just really following my interests and talking to people that I find interesting. How do you select guests? What do you think makes for an interesting conversation? Obviously, I talk mostly to like academic scientists and, physicians with a research background, those types of people, but other people as well. But the main way I select guests is I literally just email them. If you know how to do it, it's really easy to find, basically any scientist or researcher that you want. Their emails are easy to find through their papers and stuff. I know how to do that. And I just reach out to people if I see research that looks really interesting and well done. It's doing work that I find interesting. That's really who I reach out to. I don't have a lot of control over, obviously I have complete control over who I reach out to, who I send those emails to. I have no control over who responds to me, right? And so there's a lot of people that I reach out to that never respond or that can't do it or that are too busy that I would love to have on. Some people I've never heard of before. There's plenty of guests where I've never really heard of them before, but I stumble on their paper or I hear about it somewhere, looks interesting, and then I have them on, even though I've never heard them speak before. I don't have a lot of control over, how excited and enthusiastic the guests are, how verbose they are, how well spoken they are. There's, obviously some variability there. I think the number one thing is just picking people that are doing stuff that you find interesting, that I find interesting. And, naturally, if you reach out to a scientist or a physician that's doing research, they're really interested in what they're putting all the research effort into. And they're typically, more often than not, happy and excited to talk about someone who's also excited about it. And another thing is just the most interesting conversations, I think, are with people that, are truly studying or writing about or working on what they are really interested in, what they're genuinely curious about, and being able to calibrate what you say to your level of knowledge and being able to express to whoever you're talking to that, I know a lot about this, I can go into detail, or I know a medium amount about this, but I'm not an expert in it, or I don't know very much about this, so take this with a grain of salt, or we shouldn't talk about this because I don't really know what I'm talking about. I think, being able to gauge that's a really good skill to have and to cultivate and to display for people. And a lot of guests are really good about doing that, some better than others. Yeah. And I think that's it. To some extent, you just can't control it. I think, I think guest speaks the most freely when they can tell that, nothing is scripted here. And it's not, obviously I have some bullet points and some questions that I put together, but, I let the conversations go wherever they may. And I try to keep it, natural and organic in that sense. And I think when people feel like it is, the conversation flows better, and they don't feel like they're being interviewed by a reporter with, a series of preconceived questions. And I think that's pretty much what I have to say about that. What are some of the most important things you've learned in your time hosting the podcast? Are there any insights that you wish the general public was more cognizant of? Well, yeah. There's definitely a lot I've learned. I mean, this is a science podcast, basically. Obviously, there's lots of facts and new results that I learn about and that I hope people take something away from in this. But I would say a bigger, I think I want to answer this in a little bit more of a bigger picture thing. Are there any sort of themes or things I'm picking up on and learning that sort of cut across all of the episodes, or at least many of the episodes? There's a few things I could say there. One, so I'm sort of the mindset that I think, a growing number of people are of, which is that we're living through a time of sort of cultural change and turmoil right now. Some would even say we're living through a time of civilizational decay. And a big part of that is that our institutions are rapidly changing. In many ways, they're in a sort of state of turmoil or decline. I think that includes things like media institutions. I think that includes things like the educational apparatus in the school system. And I think that includes things like our universities. And all of these things are hooked up to the government apparatus in different ways and to different degrees. And for all sorts of different reasons that I'm not going to necessarily spell out here, our institutions are really in a state of flux right now. Trust in them, has degraded quite a bit. The quality in many cases has degraded in terms of, the services they're actually providing for society. Basically, we spend more than ever on education, but we're worse than ever at it. Literacy and, math literacy rates are really lower than they pretty much have been in the modern era in our school systems, et cetera, et cetera. Within academia and what you might call the university industrial complex, very big name scientists have been basically caught having put out, a number of papers that are fraudulent or likely fraudulent. People at big name universities like Stanford have had to step down from very prestigious posts. There's replication crisis after replication crisis. Lots of papers now are verifiably being made either by AI systems, or they contain suspicious images that indicate fraudulent behavior. And one of the things I've learned is that while there's still a lot of really good science going on out there, and that's predominantly who I'm talking to, people that I think are doing interesting and good science, you can also start to detect a little bit where things get a little blurry and where people, aren't operating from a place of pure truth seeking and intellectual rigor. They're operating from a place of bureaucratic entanglement and being financially connected to different special interests. To give just one example of this where I think it came out in the podcast, I'll give one example where I think it came out in the podcast from a research scientist, and then I'll give another example of a podcast that's more like about this topic. There was one podcast I did that I was super excited to do, I think last year, and it was with a scientist. I believe her name was Selena Wong, and the title is something like The Dirty Secret About Vegetable Oils. And I was really interested in this topic and really interested to talk to this person because this was a chemist, a scientist at I forget which university, and she was basically doing a lot of analysis of vegetable oils and other food products, cooking oils and foods and things like that. And long story short, as some of you will know, but maybe not all of you, a lot of the vegetable and cooking oils that you can buy at the store are not what they say they are. Some of them are like, rancid. So it might be a bottle of olive oil that's made from rancid olives instead of fresh olives. A lot of these things are adulterated, partially or even completely. So you might buy a bottle of extra virgin olive oil, which has basically been spiked with some amount of soybean oil. And so, so this conversation I had with Selena, was going over her work, which was to actually pull this stuff off of store shelves and measure what's inside of it. And, literally measure, quantify exactly what's in all of these vegetable oil products. And that's important, right? Because now you can actually show that a large percentage of things are not what they claim to be, sometimes to a very large extent, sometimes to a medium, and sometimes to a small extent. And that's very useful, right? It would be very useful if then it would be a great public service if we could say, and here's what they are. Imagine how useful it would be if you could go to this work as a consumer and be like, I want to know which brands making vegetable oils, which ones are actually giving me what they say they're giving me and which ones are hucksters. And so at some point in this conversation with Selena, I was like, okay, so you found all of these, vegetable oil brands that are giving people adulterated products or just, products that are rancid or whatever. What are the brands that are good? What are the good brands out there that are selling what they say they are? And what are the bad actors out there that are really, really deceiving people? And she wouldn't tell me. And I said, why wouldn't you tell me that? Why wouldn't we share that with people? That's useful. And that is good for human health. We are helping people find things that are real. And that has real ramifications for your health, right? If I buy something that's olive oil, I want to know that I'm eating olive oil and not soybean oil. And she wouldn't tell me. And I said, well, why wouldn't you tell people that? And she said, well, me and the university just decided that it's not our job to police the industry. And I said, well, that's not policing the industry. That's just making available the data you have. Isn't that sort of like your duty as a scientist? And, basically she said, blah, blah, blah. It's not our duty to police the industry. And I'll let you guys go listen to that episode and interpret it for yourself. But the way that I interpreted that, the way that I read between the lines is that scientists like this are working at universities. They're bringing in grant money. And they're bringing in funding. When you talk about food science, the grant funding isn't purely just like NIH grants and things like that. A lot of this funding comes from private industry, including food companies, including vegetable oil companies. And so, my take on that conversation was that it was revealed through her words that there are financial entanglements whereby some of these cooking oil companies and other companies are probably injecting a solid amount of cash into the university system to fund research like this. And part of the quid pro quo there is that when the results might cast a negative light on the people providing the money, that their names will not be named. And I think that's what's going on. I think the university probably tells scientists like that, we're not going to name these people because we need these research dollars to keep coming in, especially if you want to, keep your lab funded and your prospects for tenure secure, et cetera, et cetera. That's my interpretation. I believe it's a plausible one, even though I can't prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt. But, the more that you, having come from academia, having had conversations like that, having studied the sociology and the psychology and the politics of academic science, I can tell you that those entanglements certainly are there. And for better or for worse, people can't just operate from a standpoint of pure, hardcore truth seeking and scientific curiosity. There are other considerations in mind. People have to pay their bills. They have to secure tenure. And for better or worse, there are all kinds of financial entanglements that go into this stuff. And so that's something that I would always be cautious of, always be wary of. There's no such thing as a pure truth seeker. There's no such thing as a purely objective, dispassionate scientist. We're all human. We all have motivations and emotions and career goals and all of the things that we all have. And that goes for scientists as well. And so I think you can see that come out if you kind of know how to read between the lines in some of the episodes. Another episode that's sort of about a related topic to that is an early episode I did with a scientist named Michael Eisen. And I'll just keep it brief. He's kind of famous / infamous in the scientific world. He has his own lab. He's a scientist, but he also runs a open access peer-reviewed journal. So he's been a big advocate for open access journals. So instead of, paying privately run, highly profitable journals that charge, exorbitant fees for the research, he thinks sort of everyone should move to the open access model. So we talked about the scientific publishing industry and how sort of broken and corrupt it is. For those of you that don't know, the bigger scientific publishers, the people running things like Nature magazine and Cell Press and things like that, these are big businesses, highly profitable. Not an exaggeration to say that they sort of hold academics hostage. Scientists are not paid to review papers. This is basically a free service scientists willfully provide to journals out of a sense of duty, and also because, frankly, there's a lot of quid pro quo that happens there. If you know how to see that, you can find it. People, I can tell you for a fact, it's a lot easier to get your work published in the high impact, highly competitive brand name journals if you have a first name basis relationship with the editors and you know them and you're constantly reviewing papers for them, right? You do this for me, I scratch your back, you scratch mine, stuff that happens. Certain papers don't get published because they're considered dangerous in different ways, not necessarily because the science isn't rigorous or good. You've seen this happen. You see this happens all the time, but you see this happen with highly politicized issues. So stuff to do with SARS-CoV-2 and the mRNA vaccines. If you follow that stuff at all, you may have watched episodes I've done with people like Alina Chan or Kevin McKernan or Alex Washburn. There's a lot of backdoor communication that happens, and whether or not something is published in the literature and published in the brand name journals is not purely a matter of merit and rigor. and scientific prowess. There's a lot of politicking and social engineering that happens behind the scenes. So that episode with Michael Eisen, episode 17, I believe, that one is about scientific publishing, what's wrong with it, and sort of open access versus for-profit journals and all that stuff. That's sort of something that's sort of wrapped around my interest in science research. And you always have to keep in mind that, again, this is not a realm of pure objectivity. We should have ideals that we aspire to, but always remember that we're human beings here, all of us, even those of us with laboratories and PhDs and who are doing things that we think of as sort of objective and all about truth seeking. There's always more to it than that, and you always have to keep that in the back of your mind. Finally, how about some controversial or polemical ideas or theories that are worth considering? Yeah, to riff a little bit off what I just said, I think, there's quite a bit of corruption in science, just like there is in all human enterprises. And any time that you've got people competing for high status positions where a lot of resources are on the line, you're always going to have corruption. The level of corruption will be proportional to the level of status and the level of resources that are at stake. I'll share an idea with you that is an idea that I think is really interesting from a thinker that I would love to have on the podcast. There's a man at the University of Connecticut named Peter Turchin, and he has a field that he calls cryodynamics, which is, he's basically attempting to make the study of history more scientific and more quantitative. He's of the belief that there is some level of predictability to what happens in history, and you can actually predict certain things at a macro scale with some level of fidelity, not with perfect fidelity by any means, about history. And there's definitely a lot of his work reminds me of the phrase that history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. And there are certain sort of cycles that tend to be seen in human history. Civilizations are built, they flourish, they stagnate, and then they decline and eventually collapse. Every civilization dies at some point. And Turchin's the thing that really drew me to his ideas initially was just the startling realization that 10, 20 years ago, many years ago, he was making the prediction explicitly in his writings that the 2020s would be a decade of immense political turmoil for the U.S. This would culminate in political violence, potentially even outright civil war. Long story short, the concept I want to come here that comes from Turchin is elite overproduction. And he believes this is one of the key variables that he believes from his research drives the decline in quality that you see in late stage civilizations that's related to civilizational decline. Overproduction of elites is exactly what you see all over the place, including places like academia. Basically, 100 years ago, to get into university, it was a very small percentage of the population that did this. People that went to college at prestigious universities to get a college education, they used to, be able to read and write ancient Greek and Latin, and do, fairly advanced mathematics, and, be very, very literate in all kinds of different ways to even be considered to go to college. And over time, what became the industry, the college industry, became so profitable that they wanted to funnel as many people as possible through that apparatus. And, we all know where we're at today, where, you're expected as an average citizen to go to college. We always say that you need, growing up, I was told you need to get a college degree if you're going to make yourself anything. Many professions to this day still require you to have a college degree to even apply before they'll even consider you, no matter what that college degree is. That it could be, they don't say, it sort of just matters that you have a college degree. Somehow this degree is this magical credential that's supposed to be a free ticket to a prosperous career. And this whole sort of university industrial complex just evolved to funnel as many students as possible with as high a tuition rates as possible through this apparatus, and it's become a wealth extraction mechanism. And we've produced more and more people with degrees competing for jobs. And so that's sort of what we're seeing the ramifications of today. Part of the reason I think some of the economic issues we have are related to this elite overproduction concept, to this production of people with credentials that all of whom believe they're entitled to these high level positions and high level careers and jobs. But there's just too many people competing for too few jobs, and this results in turmoil. I think this thesis of elite overproduction from Peter Turchin is very interesting. I think it can explain a lot, and I would highly recommend looking into it if you have the time. He's written books on this. He's written a book recently called The End of Times. It's very interesting. It's probably the one to go to because it summarizes all of his work up to this date. I've read parts of that one. The one that I've read in full is called War and Peace and War. And it gets into this idea of elite overproduction and other things and how that ties into civilizational cycles. The idea that, cycles inevitably decline and that the US is in a state of civilizational decline. I think it's fair to call that a somewhat controversial topic. I think more and more people are of that mind today, but, Turchin's been making some of these bold predictions for years and decades now. And I think most people were calling him crazy when he was first saying, 20, 30 years ahead of time that we'd be in a state of potentially civil war. And, look at us now. Okay, next question. How do you stay up to date on the latest research and developments in your areas of interests? A lot. So I would say there's two or three related mechanisms there. One, I use social media in a way that reveals a lot of new research to me. So my social media platform that I spend the most time on is X, aka Twitter. And I use Twitter, I think, in somewhat of a different fashion than most people or than the standard use of Twitter. So I'll just briefly describe that. So I don't follow anybody on Twitter. I'm following zero. Instead, what I do is I create lists and then I put people into different lists. Depending on the topic. So like I have a science and data list, and people who are doing interesting science or sharing like data related, science related stuff, they go on the science and data list. I have a psychedelics list. I have a like history and philosophy list, and so on and so forth. By not following anyone, but curating people into lists based on topics like that, I find that gives me a much better X experience, a much better Twitter experience. It gives me more quality information. I found, I'm basically using X is basically for me. I'm using it in a way that's very much akin to what a newspaper used to be, right? People who, we used to read physical newspapers, and there was a politics section, a finance section, a sports section, a science section. And that's really how X functions for me. And so I see things in my main feed, and then obviously in my science and data feed that, people are constantly sharing their research, other people's research, saying, look at this, offering their opinions and interpretations. And I find a lot of new research that way. The tool that I use for browsing the research, all of the research that's out there now, my tool of choice that I recently discovered is called Consensus. And it's sort of like, you could sort of think of it as like ChatGPT for PubMed or Google Scholar. It's a large language model based AI system that's trained on the research literature, basically all of the scientific studies that you can find on things like Google Scholar and PubMed or whatever. And so instead of just looking for individual papers, like I used to predominantly use Google Scholar, I would have to sort of know that I was interested in a particular paper that I already know about, or know I'm looking for a particular scientist. You can actually just write more general and basic queries into Consensus, and it'll give you not just literature, but sort of summaries of where that field is. So, if you're interested, say, you're interested in the effects of dietary cholesterol intake on cholesterol levels in the body, you can type in, what are the effects of dietary cholesterol on serum cholesterol levels in human beings? It'll actually give you a whole list of papers. It will tell you how often those papers are cited and sort of, are they review papers? Are they experimental papers? Are they randomized controlled trials, et cetera, et cetera. It'll give you summaries of sort of like what the field seems to say. It'll say, well, in general, people find that dietary cholesterol levels are poorly correlated with serum cholesterol levels, blah, 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 blah. And so it's like a really nice way to get a summary, a sort of a state of the field. What is the state of the field around a given research question? So I use that now to get a sense for certain questions and what is known about them, what's out there in terms of what's already published about them. And then obviously I can also use that to just find individual papers that I know are out there. I use Consensus to actually find papers when I'm looking for research questions that I don't know a lot about, or find papers that I specifically have in mind. But the stuff that I become interested in, or I first hear about, I'm often hearing about that on X, or even in the conversations with my podcast guests. They do this type of thing all the time. For example, my last conversation with June Round, I asked her a question sort of indirectly related to her specific research. And she said, I don't know as much about that particular area, but a good person for that is so-and-so at this university. You should check them out. So I do find quite a bit of people to talk to and papers to look at through word of mouth like that. So yeah, X is good if you curate your experience. Consensus is great. I think it's much better than the traditional tools like PubMed and Google Scholar. And just talking to people helps too. Are there any podcasts that you listen to and would recommend? I mean, at this point, there's so many podcasts out there. I think you just have to follow your interests. I will say, so I'm doing, if you haven't noticed, so I've got the regular podcast. I've also started doing what I'm calling the Independent Scholars subseries. And this is where I talk to people who I think are really interesting, really smart, have really sort of unique knowledge base and have interesting perspectives on things, but they're not necessarily associated or working squarely within traditional institutions. So they're not. One of those episodes was with a guy named Rudyard Lynch, who has a podcast / YouTube channel that I stumbled on it, or someone shared it with me not too long ago, and I thought he was doing some pretty interesting and even provocative stuff, talking about some taboo subjects, but who clearly had this just immense and extraordinary knowledge of history, of different aspects of history and different areas of history. And so his podcast is called What If Alt Hist? That's like what if as a question, and then alternative history. Apparently he got his start by just sort of exploring alternative history, like, what if the Allies lost World War II? What if, this happened instead of what actually happened? And it sort of morphed into like an actual history and sort of current events podcast. He integrates information from lots of different areas, but obviously his main expertise, his main knowledge base comes from history. And so that's really interesting for me. I've learned a lot there because obviously my background is in biology and sort of the hardcore experimental sciences. But I'm also interested in topics, related to history and sociology and social psychology and things like that. And so I have listened to a number of those episodes, and I think they're really interesting. So look for my Independent Scholar series as well. Those episodes are available in audio format and video format on YouTube. Those ones are available in full to paid subscribers, and I'm making roughly half or so of them. Half of each episode, give or take, is freely available to everyone. But those, I intend and hope to have some more interesting podcast people on there. I think there's a lot out there. What are your thoughts on the psychedelic renaissance as a whole? How impactful do you think the research into psychedelics will be for the development of novel intervention? Well, big question. Obviously, I've had a number of guests on that are related to this directly or indirectly. A lot of scientists studying psychedelics, people involved in psychedelic startups, and so forth. I have been interested in and studying and experienced with psychedelics in different ways for many, many years. This is an area of relative expertise for me. I would say, I know a lot about psychedelics and psychedelic-like compounds, how they work in the brain. Obviously, that is informed by my formal background in neuroscience, as well as all of the independent study I've been doing probably over a decade now related to that stuff. And, clearly I'm interested in it because I've talked to a number of guests about this. I have a lot of opinions here. Some of them are, well-formed. Some of them are partially formed. This is a fast-moving area where there's going to be a lot of developments. And so my opinions are obviously subject to change and will probably evolve over time. But off the top of my head, here are some of the things I have to say. So there's this question out there: can we make quote unquote non-psychedelic psychedelics? More specifically, there is a lot of interest and a lot of effort and a lot of money going right now to research efforts that take psychedelics and psychedelic-like compounds, things like anything from MDMA to true classic psychedelics like LSD, and trying to alter these or tweak these to create psychedelic-like derivatives that have therapeutic benefits that they retain, but are devoid of the psychedelic or psychoactive components that many view as negative side effects that we don't need or that aren't necessary for the therapeutic benefit. So, right, the idea here is, can we make a non-psychedelic version of psilocybin that is still really good for treating something like major depression? Can we take something like MDMA and tweak it so that it can cure severe PTSD, but it's not going to be psychoactive. People aren't going to be abusing it at raves or whatever, and so on and so forth. I think my views on whether or not that effort will be successful align most closely with the guest I've had on named Dr. Gould Dolan. And I'll let you go listen to the 2 episodes I've done with her, including the last episode where she discusses some of the recent research she's done in her lab related to this question. But I think 2 things are true simultaneously. People will absolutely develop psychedelic derivatives that are less psychoactive or non-psychoactive that will have some kind of therapeutic benefit. That's definitely going to happen, and great if they do that. I don't think they're going to be very successful at generating psychedelic derivatives which lack psychedelic or psychoactive effects that are as potently therapeutic as some of the psychedelics and related compounds seem to be. I think the experience is going to end up being an important part of the therapeutic component for many of these things, at least when it comes to severe and complex neuropsychiatric conditions. Things like refractory depression, things like severe PTSD. I don't think it's a coincidence that when these therapies work, the patients often say that the experience was consequential. They often say that the symbolism they have when they are quote unquote tripping is directly related related to their recovery. I talked to a man in an early episode who went through psilocybin-assisted therapy for his alcoholism. And he talked about how he had many experiences and lots of symbolism related directly to his alcoholism. He saw, bottles breaking and turning into sand, which he thought symbolized the alcoholism leaving his body. And he was successful. And, he did kick the habit, years later, as of the time of that recording, at least. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think it's going to be difficult to separate the trip from the therapeutic components here. Gould Dolan's view is essentially that the psychoactive effects of things like classical psychedelics, as well as things like ketamine and MDMA, are tied into the molecular mechanisms that are necessary to induce the metaplasticity that is enabling the therapeutic benefit to take place. I think in some sense, if you think about it from the metaplasticity standpoint, right, think about something like major depression or PTSD or neuropsychiatric conditions like this. The problem is not a tumor located in a particular part of the brain that needs to be excised. The problem is that all kinds of synapses and circuits are behaving in complex ways that manifest as something like depression or something like PTSD. And the only way that you're going to change all of those things in an adaptive fashion is by inducing a state of metaplasticity that enables them to change. And they're only going to change if directed to change. So I think the psychedelics and the other compounds that are tied to metaplasticity, they're providing a permissive signal that enables the brain to change adaptively if it's directed to do so. And I think that's where the therapy comes in, and why therapy is going to be a very important part of treating these neuropsychiatric conditions in conjunction with these plasticity related compounds. I don't think you're going to have a lot of success. A lot of people want to shove this stuff into the structure of the existing biopharmaceutical apparatus, the existing apparatus of getting FDA approval for a drug that you take at home, either probably chronically, and that's going to, make you better. I don't think that's going to be as successful as people hope. I don't think you're going to make an LSD derivative that's, going to cure people of refractory depression outside of the context of therapy. I just don't think that's as likely. I think you will create psychedelic and psychedelic-like derivatives that do other things. Charles Nichols, for example, I've talked to Charles Nichols on his own on the podcast and together with David Nichols, his father, another psychedelic scientist, in an episode where I had both of them on. And Charles Nichols, for example, he's done work on some psychedelics that seem to be very potent anti-inflammatory compounds. And I think based on that research, there's good reason to believe that they can develop those into non-psychedelic, non-psychoactive compounds that don't get into the brain and induce psychedelic states, but that nonetheless retain their potent anti-inflammatory effects. I think people will create those types of things. I wouldn't be surprised if you can create, maybe they'll create some next generation antidepressants that are like maybe, quasi-effective in the way that SSRIs maybe sort of are for some people. But I don't think they're going to create, psychedelic drug derivatives completely devoid of psychoactive effects that, are curing everyone's PTSD or anything like that. I think and I hope I'm wrong, but I think people want that to be true so desperately because they know it will be a huge moneymaker if they can make it. And I think they're probably trying to shove a square peg into a round hole. But we'll know soon. People like David Olson, who I've had on the podcast, people like Brian Roth, who I've had on the podcast, they are doing work trying to create these psychedelic derivatives. That work is mostly in animals. And they, if you read between the lines, they seem to think that they're developing these things. They probably have unpublished evidence that indicates that. I think you're going to see hints of it in the animal work. And I think that will probably plausibly fail to translate to humans, either because something that doesn't look like it's actually psychedelic in an animal model is in fact psychoactive to some significant degree in a human, because the animal models are imperfectly capturing that, or simply doesn't have the therapeutic efficacy that's implied by the animal studies. Keep in mind, look at the whole field of psychiatry up till now. Look at everything. We've been doing animal studies for decades, study after study after study, literally hundreds of these goddamn things where, the animal studies look like it's a potent antidepressant, but it just doesn't translate that effectively to humans. Remember, mice and rats are not humans. When they say that they've found antidepressant-like effects in a mouse when they give it a drug, what that means is, they put the mouse in a bright maze and it moves around in one part of the maze a little bit less or a little bit more when it's on the drug. And then we hope that means it's going to turn into a blockbuster antidepressant. But, basically 9 times out of 10, at least, that's not how things turn out. Either the drugs turn to have some kind of toxicity or unwanted side effects by the time we get them into humans, or they simply don't have the clinical effect in humans that they seemed to maybe have when we gave them to a mouse in a highly contrived laboratory circumstance. And I suspect most of these attempts to create these psychedelic drug derivatives are going to underperform and underwhelm. I guess that's what I'll say for that for now. Obviously, there'll be a lot more content on that coming up. I'll probably talk to a lot of these people again as new studies come out. This is definitely an area of interest for me. Is it talking about psychedelics still? Is this area overhyped or a genuine complete paradigm shift? I think the combination of thoughtful and deliberate psychotherapy with some of these drugs is going to be very beneficial for a lot of people if it gets approved. I suspect, given what's happened recently with MAPS and the FDA rejection of that whole thing, this is obviously going to take longer than we hoped to come to fruition, if it does at all. Probably there's going to be a lot of people doing this stuff underground, which comes with its own potential risks and benefits. But I think, I'm personally in my life, I'm past the idea that we're going to develop magic pills that your psychiatrist, isn't going to say you have PTSD. We've got this perfect drug that hits the perfect synapses in the perfect way. And all you have to do is take it once a week for X amount of years and you're not going to have PTSD anymore. I would not hold my breath on that. If that's the way things work, if our biology was set up for things to work in that way, we'd be on our 20th generation of SSRIs and antipsychotics by now, because we've had decades and decades of animal research where they give them yet another new antidepressant, yet another new antipsychotic, putative antipsychotic, potential antidepressant, and the mice move a little bit this way and a little bit that way, and they show these quote unquote anxiety-like behaviors. And yet, if all of these things were as promising as the animal researchers in this realm like to say they are, then we'd be on our 40th generation antipsychotics that work 10 times better than what we actually have today. And that's not what the research has done. So I just don't think you fix the brain by taking a pill over and over again. What is your philosophy of drugs and drug use? How do you define drugs? Well, there's formal and informal definitions for these things, of course. The formal definition of drugs, I believe Brian Roth gave that on my first podcast with him way back when. Drugs are small molecules below a certain size that basically have, certain effects in the brain and body. I think when you say drugs here, the question I think is talking about psychoactive drugs, so drugs that are affecting the nervous system and altering consciousness in some way, shape, or form. I think that's a reasonable definition. A drug is essentially just a small molecule that alters your conscious experience in some way, shape, or form. That can be something as potent as a psychedelic like DMT. That can be something much more innocuous like an SSRI, right? You're not going to have hallucinations on an SSRI, but it is going to shift your mood one way or another. Whether or not it actually helps cure your depression or not is a different question. It is psychoactive. Alcohol is psychoactive. Benzodiazepines are psychoactive. Nitrous oxide is psychoactive. LSD is psychoactive. Caffeine is psychoactive, right? It's mildly psychoactive. I'm on caffeine right now. So I don't, let's just go with that as a basic definition of drugs, small molecules that affect consciousness. What is your drugs and drug use situation? I'll give you a partial answer to that. I have lots of experiences with lots of different psychoactive substances. I've tried pretty much every psychedelic or psychedelic adjacent compound you can think of, with just a few exceptions. I've had a number of psilocybin experiences in my life. My first big psychedelic experience was with psilocybin, several grams of dried psilocybin mushrooms when I think I was like 17. I ended up by myself, alone in silent darkness. And as Terence McKenna would say, this is, that's how you trip hardest. And I would definitely agree with that. A large dose of a classic psychedelic, a tryptamine like psilocybin, alone in silent darkness, as opposed to being, out in the bright sunshine with your friends, actively doing things, your visions are going to be deeper and more potent. That was definitely a game changer for me. That first psilocybin experience really got me interested in the nature of consciousness and eventually, I think, neuroscience in ways that I wasn't up until that point in my life. It definitely woke me up in a way. I think I was, a teenager who thought he was pretty smart and had things figured out. And that first psilocybin experience showed me that I didn't have any idea what was going on. And I didn't know any of that was possible before I had that experience. I have also a lot of experience with DMT in different forms, including 5-MeO DMT. I have consumed vaporized NN-DMT many times in my life. Those have been very powerful and transformative experiences for me. I wouldn't recommend those for everyone. Those are only for the intrepid. Those are only for people who've done their homework and are ready for it and have a good container, a good environmental container to do that type of self-experimentation in. That's doubly true for 5-MeO DMT, arguably even more potent, a very different type of experience. I talked about that a little bit in my very, very first podcast episode with Brian Murarescu, so you can go back and listen to that if you want. I've done 5-MeO DMT 4 times. I have 4 different doses on 2 separate occasions. That's the type of thing I sort of do in a very particular setting, about once every year or so. So I have a person who I go to for that, who has very pure lab grade 5-MeO DMT. It's administered using a very specific vaporizer device that delivers a very precise defined dose all at once in a very safe container. And he's got his own sort of ritual practice that he uses to guide you through that and to just, give you some structure there. I find that very cathartic for myself psychologically. It's something, I sort of make myself do every year or so. That's just part of my routine. I've also done ayahuasca a couple times in formal, like sit down settings where I'm doing, true ayahuasca brews from the Amazon, administered from people who've done this many, many times and basically do it for a living in a traditional Amazonian style group setting. I've also done orally active DMT in more personal settings, which is, effectively the same drug experience, but obviously in a different sort of social context. Very powerful drugs. What's my philosophy? I mean, obviously, I have gotten a lot of value from doing cautious and responsible experimentation with different things in various contexts in my adult life. I don't think these are definitely not substances that are for everyone. I think you have to have a grip, enough of a grip of yourself to know who you are and whether or not you think it's worth doing these things. If you've got, you need to have a certain level of curiosity about it. You need to know whether it's a good idea or a bad idea given your psych history, right? I don't think, people with certain psychiatric conditions or predispositions should definitely tread lightly when it comes to experimenting with strongly psychoactive drugs like psychedelic. And I don't think for everyone. I think they can benefit some people and they probably won't benefit everyone. I don't think everyone is built for these. I think you can make yourself built for these, by preparing yourself in different ways. But they're definitely not for everyone. So, my general philosophy is, if people with a mature psychology are curious to try these things and they think there could be benefit and they do their homework ahead of time, they should be free to do that. And there's a lot of benefit that can come and a lot of self-knowledge and psychological maturity that can be triggered by having some of these experiences, at least having them in the right settings. But that's not guaranteed. And you definitely can take these things incorrectly. They can be destabilizing. I don't think that everyone on earth should go sit in an ayahuasca ceremony. These are very powerful substances. And if you're taking orally active DMT through, several hours a night for 3 nights in a row, that's not necessarily going to fix a problem in your life that you might be having. That's not necessarily going to reverse your depression. That's not necessarily going to make you a more enlightened person. It could trigger something terrible if it's not done with caution and in the right setting. So I think that's what I'll say about that. What would your advice be for someone looking to create a career at the intersection of medicine, psychology, neuroscience, and psychedelic research, starting from an unrelated college degree? Is this a worthwhile pursuit? Are there any specific steps or opportunities you would recommend pursuing? I don't have a lot of super specific advice here. There's a couple different levels I want to answer this on. Obviously, it's very important to follow your interests. So I think you have to follow your interests and your passion. It's more important to, I forget who said this, like, should you follow your passion? A lot of people say, absolutely, always follow your passions. And I think you should follow primarily what you're good at, which may or may not be what you're passionate about. If you can find a way to combine those things, great. But if you can't, don't sacrifice or neglect what you're actually good at for what you're passionate about. You might be passionate about painting. If you're just not a good painter and it doesn't seem to be getting better, but you're really good at, I don't know, maybe you're really good interviewing people and you should try a podcast. Maybe you're really good at sales and you should go to say, I don't know. There could be something you're really good at that is going to be a more stable profession, and you shouldn't lose sight of that for your passions. Think about, is your passion something that's more of a hobby, or is it something that can be integrated into a more concrete skill set that is usable in the context of a profession? Hopefully the answer is yes. That's very convenient if it's true, if you can match your passions to your professional skills and your concrete skills and your sellable skills. But if you can't, think about that, and it's okay to have a profession and a hobby, and those could be two separate things. Let's not lose sight of that. You want something at the intersection of medicine, psychology, neuroscience, and psychedelic research. I don't have a specific answer for you. Obviously, there's certain things that are going to be really difficult for you to do at all without certain credentials. You're obviously not going to be doing clinical research in a laboratory without a certain type of degree and a certain, technical skill set that you've been trained to have. But that doesn't mean there's nothing you can do. But I don't have a super specific answer here. I think you need to think about your passions and your interests on the one hand, and then think about your concrete skill sets on the other. The things that you're already good at because you've been trained or because you've had a natural talent for that, or things that you think you can cultivate. Because ultimately, right, you need to do something that provides value for other people. That's what a profession is. It needs to be something that people care about enough to spend time and money on, that you can then use to operate your own life. You can't merely be interested in something and then hope a career comes out of that. You really have to think about the two sides of this, the passion and the interest side, and then sort of the concrete side, the skill, the hard skills that you need to have to actually execute on something, whether that's providing a service for other people, whether that's making a physical or digital product that other people are then going to use. I think, another thing to think about is demand and what's trendy. Obviously, it's fun and it can be exciting to be part of a trend, part of what's popular. I think it's, from my own standpoint, I try to look at what are things that dovetail with my interests, where I think my skills will be useful, my hard skills that are not really popular and trending yet, but I think could be. If you're trying to go into psychedelics today, it's a very different thing than trying to go into psychedelics, whatever that means, 5-10 years ago. If you tried to do it 10 years ago, most people would be like, what does that even mean? You're crazy. You're going to study psychedelics. But now it's this huge booming area of research with lots of funding. It's this huge area in the startup world on the biotech side, where lots of money's pouring in. But that also means that means it's crowded. And all that attention and all that money and all that, sort of the ooh and ah-ness of it, that attracts people that aren't just interested in it for its own sake. It attracts people that, are trying to make as much money as possible. It attracts grifters. It attracts, all of these other elements of humanity. And that just makes the space a little bit more crowded and a little more difficult to work in. So, I don't know exactly what your talents and hard skills are, but you need to sort of have a clear sense for that and develop those things in addition to knowing that you're interested in medicine, psychology, neuroscience, psychedelics, etc. It's not enough just to know what you're interested in. If you were starting your career now, knowing what you know, what would you focus on learning and doing differently? Are there any skills or experiences that you found to be particularly useful? Sure. I mean, I'll answer that, but before I give the answer that I think you're looking for, I sort of, in a way, I don't like questions like this. It's sort of like, if you could go back in time and do everything over again, what would you like? Of course, I would do things differently. Yes, of course, if I could go back in time and buy some Amazon stock and learn certain skills and meet certain people, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, with the benefit of hindsight, you can say what you would have, should have, could have done. But of course, that's not the universe we live in. We can never do that. And in some sense, I don't like to dwell on questions like this because, the more you dwell on the past, the more you're not acting in the present in ways that will set up your future for success, whatever that means. I think you should reflect on the past insofar as you learn a lesson that helps you make decisions in the present, and then you move on. I don't think you should dwell on things longer than that. You certainly shouldn't ruminate on them. That's a hallmark of depression, when you ruminate and you stew on something over and over and over again, even though you're not learning anything from it anymore. Yeah. So, I mean, in general, I think, let's separate this into sort of hard skills and soft skills. And I guess the last question maybe ties into this a little bit. So maybe the person who asked that will also get something from this question. I'm going to think about my hard skills that I have and the hard skills that I wish I had or could have had if I cultivated them more. And then the same thing for soft skills. So let's start with soft skills. I always had a natural talent for public speaking. I think that's why the podcast is sort of a natural fit for me, and I've had some success with it. I'm very good at one-on-one conversations, and I'm very good at one-on-many conversations. I've always been had a natural talent for public speaking. I can give a good talk. I can capture people's attention if you put me in front of them. And that was something that I think I had a natural talent for. So I got some reinforcement from others from it. And so I cultivated that over time. I cultivated that, in graduate school, and in college, because, naturally as someone who's a scientist in training, a scientist is always sort of preparing to give a talk. Everything you do is kind of geared towards telling people about it in the form of a talk, telling a story about the data. And so I was able to cultivate that talent through that kind of format. Obviously, the podcast is kind of an extension of that. Also, my work in the private sector, which I haven't really talked about. I spent 8 years at a technology startup. I did a lot of sort of speaking at the company level and at the public level there that helped cultivate that. So I think, you always want to pay attention to what you're naturally good at or inclined to and try and cultivate that. And then obviously you want to, beef up your weak areas to some extent. So I'm not naturally a people person in the sense of, just being able to have small talk with anyone or necessarily being like the life of the party. That's something I think I wish I would have started cultivating and practicing earlier on. I think I started doing that a little too late. I think I should have recognized the value that comes from having those sort of soft people skills earlier. If I could have done that starting in my late teens or early 20s as opposed to my mid to late 20s, I think I would have been better off. In terms of, hard skills, obviously I picked up a lot of hard skills from my scientific training, the scientific training per se, but also the ability to write technically and clearly, the ability to distill complexities into more specific forms of communication, both visually and in writing. That's a good skill to have, the technical communication skills, the technical research abilities, the ability to pose questions well and think systematically about them, and to think in sort of predictive if-then terms. If this idea is true, then I should see this. If that idea is true, then I should see this instead. And then going out and, having that hypothesis testing mindset. I'm very glad I did that. That's a skill that I have. Technically, I wish I would have gotten more quantitative training earlier. I picked up more mathematical ability and computer programming ability through my Ph.D. training. And after that, when I got into the tech sector, I wish I would have done that earlier. I think especially in today's day and age, reaching some minimal level of comfort with that stuff, with both math and computer programming and sort of how those things tie together. I'm not saying everyone needs to become a computer scientist or a data engineer, but the same way that, everyone needs to learn how to read and write if they want to get by in society. I think, getting some basic baseline literacy early on is better. We sort of soak in information and learn better earlier in life. I didn't have I was in grade school and my family got a computer. I'm sort of an old millennial. So I lived at like the transition from most people not having computers and internet access to everyone having them, and then smartphones and then social media. It would have been wonderful in retrospect if I would have started learning computer programming and some higher mathematics at an earlier age as a child, but that's not something I could have really helped. But, cultivating some of those hard skill sets, I think, does have payoff, even if you're not a computer scientist or a data person. So now we've got some, very different types of questions here, diet questions. From a dietary and supplemental standpoint, what would help support rapid growth and regeneration after physical trauma, rebuilding tools, blah, blah, blah. What would help, basically rebuilding after a physical trauma, I guess like a breaking a bone or something. All I'm going to say there is the guiding principle for me when I think about what to eat is, you want your nutrition to be as bioavailable as possible. It doesn't matter so much how much nutrition is in your food. It matters how readily your body can extract the nutrition that is in your food. If something has a lot of vitamins and minerals, but your body can't get them out of the food and into your own body, of what use are those vitamins and minerals? From that standpoint, animal products, animal-based whole foods are generally going to be they're going to have more bioavailable nutrition than plant-based foods, generally speaking. That's true for macronutrients like proteins. That's true for fat-soluble vitamins like vitamin D, vitamin K, and so forth. And that's often actually also true for micronutrients, things like calcium. So you're going to need to consume nutrient-rich foods, those rich in bioavailable nutrients. So when I think about something like regenerating bone growth or regenerating muscle after an injury or after I've been sitting in a cast for weeks or months at a time, you're going to want something caloric and nutrient dense, something that's very bioavailable in its nutrition content. That makes me think of animal products. That makes me think of things like dairy and milk. If you can tolerate those, obviously not everyone can tolerate those things. There's a huge spectrum of people and a lot of genetic diversity in terms of our tolerance for things like dairy products. But if you're tolerant of dairy products, you're going to get a lot of fat soluble vitamins that are often hard to get from other sources, especially in modernity. And, a very interesting book here that points you to some of these fat soluble nutrients that you see a lot in dairy and other animal products is one that I'm reading right now that I recommend. It's from the 1930s, I believe. It's by Weston Price, who was a dentist back in the early part of the 20th century. The book I have right here, it's called Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. And he basically goes around the world and looks at people who've been isolated and have traditional lifestyles and traditional diets and compares them to nearby people's same country, same region, same genetics that have been exposed to modern diets and modern foods. And what he finds over and over again all over the world is that those on the traditional diets with the traditional lifestyles tend to be more physically healthy and robust. They have straighter teeth. They don't have nearly as many cavities and rotten teeth. Their facial cranial morphology is just more robust. Their teeth aren't crooked because their jaws grow in big enough to accommodate the teeth. They have, more square jaw lines and so on and so forth. They also tend to be less susceptible to diseases like, tuberculosis. And you wouldn't necessarily think that the health of your teeth and your bones is related to your susceptibility to infectious disease like that. But, when you read a book like this and you consider other things, maybe it is. And long story short, he ties a lot of this to eating, natural traditional foods that enable one to absorb a lot of these vitamins, including fat soluble vitamins that are harder to extract from modern processed foods like refined grains and some of these plant-based products that are being pushed heavily on people today. So think about getting nutrient-rich foods, where nutrient-rich means they not only contain the nutrients, but your body can actually extract those. And for me, that's almost always going to mean animal foods. I don't think you can eat a fully plant-based diet without significant and judicious supplementation and get the nutrition you need. If you were to write a fat loss plan for someone without ruining their metabolism, example, extensive starvation, but maybe even fixing or improving their metabolism, how would you do it? What strategies would you ask the person to take? And would you tailor it to individuals, or would it largely be the same? So basically, this is saying, if I was going to give someone a fat loss plan, what would I say? How individualized would that plan be? What would that involve eating? Like, obviously, anyone's going to lose weight if they starve themselves and they just don't eat anything. That's going to involve, starvation involves losing both fat and lean mass. Coincidentally, that's what these new GLP-1 drugs are doing. They're causing people to lose about comparable fat and lean mass. So it's effectively inducing a mild starvation state, it seems. But okay, what would I advise someone to do if they wanted to burn fat, preserve lean mass, and not ruin their metabolism? And ruining metabolism is supposed to be defined here as not reducing their basal metabolic rate. Okay, so here's the things I would think about. I think any plan here will need to be individualized to some extent, but also there are principles here that pretty much anyone can follow. So one thing that I would probably encourage anyone to, and I'm not going to go in order of importance here necessarily. I'm just going to kind of speak off the cuff. One thing that I encourage people to do if they are looking to burn off fat and lose fat mass is to maybe think a little, don't think just about losing the fat, think about building some muscle. And you don't need to become a bodybuilder. You don't need to be hitting the free weights every day and pounding protein shakes, but think about eating a protein-rich diet and engaging in some more resistance training than you do normally. Or again, you don't need to be an Olympic athlete or a bodybuilder here, but you do need to be engaged in some relatively strenuous resistance training, at least a couple of days a week, probably 3 or 4 days a week, to build some muscle. Again, you're not Arnold Schwarzenegger. We're not asking you to compete in Mr. Universe, but if you build some muscle, that's going to actually help you burn the fat more, because that muscle is very energetically expensive. To build it and maintain it, you're probably going to maybe increase your basal metabolic rate. You're going to be burning more calories even at rest than you otherwise would. And I think building some muscle mass is going to help you cut down on that fat mass. Another thing I would do diet-wise, let me try and think of things that sort of anyone can do. I would try and index fairly high, maybe higher than you probably are already on protein. I think the average American is getting something like maybe 15% of their calories from protein today. I think less than 20% certainly. See if you can get it up to 20+%. I don't have a specific number for you, but probably eat more protein to help you build and maintain that muscle. Also, the more protein you eat, in general, the literature seems to be pretty clear on this. A higher protein diet will be more satiating, so that will likely help you combat, any food cravings, any junk food cravings you might be struggling with. And then from there, you got to think about where you're going to get your energy from. I think the protein, you can ultimately get energy from protein if you need to. If your body's starving, it will start to break down protein in your muscles for gluconeogenesis. That's not what you want. You want to be building some muscle, consuming enough protein to enable that and to maintain that muscle mass. So you want to get your energy from fats and carbs. The question is how much of each and which particular ones to think about. So a couple things here. The average American is getting the majority of their calories from carbohydrates. I think it's on the order of 50 to 60%, but they're still also getting considerable number of calories from fat. So they're eating sort of a high to very high carb diet and simultaneously a medium high fat diet. Right now, my sort of general mindset, I'm not totally married to this, but this is how I've been thinking about it lately. I think from a macronutrient energetic standpoint, fats and carbs, you can index high on one of them, but not both of them. Some people might do better on a high carb, low fat diet. Some people might do better on a high fat, low carb diet. You want to figure out which one you are. One of those will probably be easier for you to burn fat more quickly. And one of them will also probably be easier for you to maintain. So you need to figure out and commit to which one of those two you are. Do you want to try going the ketogenic route and do high fat, ultra low carb? I think that will be effective for a lot of people, especially Americans, because Americans generally are, especially metabolically unhealthy Americans, are generally eating a high carb diet. They're already getting a majority of their nutrients from carbohydrates. So if you are struggling to lose fat and you're struggling to get metabolically healthy right now, you probably want to move away from what you've been eating, right? In terms of just macronutrient profile. So if you've been struggling to get healthy on a high carb diet, you should probably cut back on the carbohydrates. If you've been struggling to stay healthy on a high fat diet, maybe try a different one. Now, obviously, it's more complicated than that because you have to think about specific carbohydrates and specific fats. Universal principles here that I think apply to anyone. I think no matter how much fat you're consuming, I would think about fat saturation and fatty acid chain length. In general, I'm the mindset that you should be eating as little polyunsaturated fat as possible. I think there's a lot of genetic variation between people in terms of how they metabolize fatty acids, including these polysaturated fatty acids that are found in seed oils and processed foods. I think some people can not tolerate it very well at all, and they will put on a lot. I think, they will put on a lot of weight, and bad stuff will happen when they consume those. I think some people tolerate them better. I don't think that means they're okay. I think pretty much anyone will do good by cutting down on the polyunsaturated fatty acids. So that means cutting down, ideally cutting out as much as possible, things like the seed oils, things, virtually, not all processed foods, but a very, very, very large percentage of processed foods contain a lot of these PUFAs. I would cut back on those as much as possible. Think about saturated and monounsaturated fatty acids. Think about shorter chain fatty acids. Think about, I can just tell you what I cook with, and I generally recommend for cooking oils if you're going to use cooking oils. I use coconut oil. I use grass-fed butter. I think these are great. They are very low in linoleic acid, the omega-6 fatty acids that at least some people, including myself, would argue are going to generally push you in a more inflammatory direction, in a less metabolically favorable direction. I think the medium chain and short chain fatty acids that you're going to get in things like a little bit more in things like coconut oil, they're going to have a very different metabolic effect than the longer chain fatty acids. So I would think about cutting down on those PUFAs, no matter what level of fat you're consuming. And then think about that fat to carbohydrate ratio. Some people are all about like the Ray Peat style. You can eat as much sugar and honey as you want. Some people are all about, sugar is poison. I don't like to take a religious stance on these. I think people get too tribal and too religiously devoted to the different schools of thought here. I think you're going to have to do a little bit of experimentation, but I would think about, indexing high on carbs and low on fat, or high on fat, low on carbs. I would avoid as much as possible any refined carb, no matter how many carbohydrates you eat. In my view, it's very clear that you should avoid refined carbohydrates as much as possible. That means, everything from white bread to high fructose corn syrup. I'm not saying no one should eat any starch or anything. There's not a, there's plenty of people that are healthy eating, moderate or even fairly large amounts of carbohydrate. But I think you should index low on refined carbohydrates. Again, I would reference the book Nutrition and Physical Degeneration by Weston Price. One of the patterns he saw over and over again is when people ate refined carbohydrates, their teeth rotted, their bones looked worse, and they were generally poor in health. They were more susceptible to infectious disease. They were just more sickly. That means, modern refined carbohydrates, like they added sugars, the white breads, the processed refined carbohydrates, those are different than unrefined carbohydrates. There were, many examples in this book where he shows, for example, chapter 1 is about these groups of people from different parts of the Swiss Alps. The ones living, just a few kilometers away on their traditional diet were eating plenty of carbohydrate. They're eating plenty of rye bread, but it wasn't like refined white bread. It wasn't these refined starches with added sugars and stuff. They were eating plenty of rye bread together with things like butter and dairy, and they were just much healthier, even though they're more or less genetically identical and they're geographically in a very similar location, similar climate and what have you. I think the ketogenic route, it would work for a lot of people, and I would consider that, especially if you're one of these people that resembles a typical Western American style person who's not been in the best metabolic health for a lot of their adult life. Think about trying a higher fat, lower carbohydrate diet. I would try and do that for some time. It's going to take, maybe at least a month. Try and see if you can stick with it for 2 or 3 months and see what happens. I'm a big fan of doing, if you're experimenting like this, I'm a fan of experimenting like this, seeing what works, sticking with it for a while, trying something else if it doesn't. But also, if you can, try using, at-home blood testing to verify what's happening, in addition to obviously tracking your weight and your body composition and stuff. But again, go back, build muscle, eat a higher protein diet. I think that's good advice for many, many people. Play with your macronutrient ratio, the fat to carb ratio. For a lot of people, that's going to mean maybe lower carb consumption and higher fat consumption. Think about cutting down on certain types of fats that you're probably consuming a lot of now, like the PUFAs and maybe some more of the other ones. Again, just a general principle that I hope is obvious at this point for anyone who listens to me generally, cutting out processed foods as much as possible. We can cherry pick and we can argue, okay, maybe in principle, there might be some processed foods that are okay, but as a rule of thumb, directionally, the more processed the food is, the more I would focus on cutting it out. Focus on whole foods, focus on unrefined grains, as opposed to refined grains, focus on, animal products are generally going to have more bioavailable nutrition than plant-based products. I eat plenty of red meat. I eat plenty of grass-fed beef and butter. I cook with coconut oil. I eat mixed vegetables. I eat some starchy things like potatoes from time to time, but not too much. Right now, I have a high protein diet. I have a mix of fats and carbs, but I index much lower on carbohydrates than the average American and much, much, much lower on refined carbohydrates. I'm not eating a lot of candy bars. I'm not eating a lot of dessert foods. I'm not eating white bread. I eat very, 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 very little of that stuff. I'm not drinking soda. Get rid of that stuff. I think that's going to be good advice for just about anyone. Yeah. So, obviously there's a lot more I could say about that. Probably talk about that for hours and hours. And, there'd be all sorts of nuance that we could debate there, but that's where I will leave it. Okay. Last question. This is taking longer than I thought. I'm going to leave it at this one. I recently finished your episode with Dr. Georgia Eady, I forget how it is pronounced. Found myself rethinking a lot of concepts. I'm still struggling to understand zero carb recommendation. The whole idea that glucose can be supplied to the brain endogenously and sufficiently from proteins and fat only. Not sure how it's possible from fat, even though the speaker mentioned it. I was wondering if you can give me an opinion on this. Okay, great question. So yeah, my episode with Georgia Eady, we talked a lot about things like ketogenic diet, carnivore diet. What if you're on an ultra low carb diet where you're consuming very little or even no carbohydrates? Your body, your brain, all your cells are going to use glucose. They need glucose. So the question is, how do they get glucose in the absence of eating any dietary carbohydrate? It sounds like there's confusion there on the proteins versus fats piece. So yes, you don't need to consume any carbohydrates. Your body will actually generate glucose endogenously, even if you're consuming zero dietary carbohydrate. Gluconeogenesis, so gluco as in glucose, sugar, new genesis to create. So creating sugar from can be done. Gluconeogenesis can be done from proteins and it can be done from fats. Normally, it's not going to be done from proteins unless you're kind of in a starvation state, right? So unless your body really needs it and you're like wasting away, starving in the desert, it's not going to happen, but it can be done, right? So, again, if you're out starving yourself because you have anorexia or because you're stranded in the desert for 40 days and 40 nights, whatever it may be, your body can take some of the protein in your muscles, say, and it will break those down and create glucose through the process of gluconeogenesis from those amino acids. It can also happen from fats. So remember, most fat in the body is stored as a triglyceride. That's a glycerol molecule, a glycerol backbone with three fatty acid compounds stapled to that glycerol molecule. So what happens with gluconeogenesis from fats is that basically like a triglyceride can be pulled apart into its constituent pieces. So that's, for each triglyceride, that would be 3 fatty acids and 1 glycerol. The fatty acids themselves can be converted to energy into ketone bodies, right? So that's kind of what ketosis means. You've got more ketone bodies floating around because your body's using fat for energy to generate those ketone bodies. That puts you into the ketogenic state. But that glycerol backbone can then also be used for gluconeogenesis. So actually, the fats can be used to create glucose. So that triglyceride will be pulled apart, and the glucose will be created from the glycerol backbone of that triglyceride, while the fatty acids are going to be used for the ketone body part of it. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. It is possible to live and survive and even thrive without any dietary carbohydrate. Obviously, that's not a normal state of affairs for most humans most of the time. The last thing I'll say here, this actually connects to the last question about fat loss. I think there is something to be said about metabolic switching. I did an episode about metabolic switching, transitioning from ketosis into other metabolic states and back again with a man named Dr. Mattson that I thought was really interesting. And, I don't necessarily think it's natural for most humans to always be on one diet all the time. I think, in most traditional ecologically natural circumstances, our human ancestors would have been cycling between diets on, a seasonal basis. And that's especially true if you're descended from people that lived away from the equator, as many of us are, where, there's seasons. There's a growing season. There's a winter. Think about animals living out in the wild, right? Like, the springtime is plentiful. The flowers are blooming. Energy is abundant. Food is abundant. They're eating one type of diet, one set of foods, and reproducing. And then, eventually fall sets in, and then winter. And obviously things are sparse in winter. Those of us descended from farmers, a lot of these were going to be seasonal farmers. So there's a growing season where you're harvesting certain things. Maybe other times of the year you're harvesting different things. Maybe for part of the year you're not harvesting anything, and you're living off stores of what you grew in the season of abundance, or other types of food, that you're hunting or whatever. So I think most of our ancestors were probably switching between different metabolic states on, say, a seasonal basis. Obviously, human hunter-gatherers, if we go back in deep history, were probably doing that often. We didn't necessarily have a surplus of food that was always constantly available. A lot of our ancestors were probably switching into and out of ketosis, if not on a weekly or monthly basis, probably on a seasonal basis. There could have been, months out of the year where people were in mostly a ketogenic state, and then other months out of the year where they were, eating more carbohydrates, from whether it's from grains or fruits or whatever. I think there is something to that. And there could be value in figuring out how to cycle through different diets and put yourself into different metabolic states for different periods of time. But you won't die without dietary carbohydrates. Your body can in fact generate all the glucose it needs without carbohydrates, as far as I'm aware, and I'm pretty sure that's definitely true. And there may be benefit. I don't like to get into holy wars where it's like, no, you should be eating carbohydrates because they're a more efficient energy source or a way to generate like more ATP per gram of food or whatever. And then other people are like, no, ketogenic is better because blah blah blah. Like, I think there's value. I think there's value in cycling into and out of these things on some cadence, and that might be what people are searching for. These diets, certain diets can be hard to maintain for a long time. There's no doubt that a lot of people, especially if you've been, addicted to processed foods your whole life and you've always had a high carbohydrate diet, it's not necessarily going to be easy to get into a state of ketosis and maintain a ketogenic diet for very long periods of time. But maybe you can do that 2 months on, 2 months off, 4 months on, 4 months off. I don't know. But I think there probably is some benefit to thinking about switching between these metabolic states and not letting your body get used to always being in one state. I don't necessarily think that's natural or what our bodies are evolved or sort of expecting to do. There's a reason why our metabolic states can shift and change. There's a reason why we can go into and out of ketosis. There's a reason why that happens more readily at different stages of development. I believe babies sort of start out in ketosis. They go into ketosis very readily. So, your diet doesn't need to be static. It probably shouldn't be static. Think about changing it season to season. Think about changing it as you age, right? The right diet for you now might not be the right diet for you when you're in your 20s, your 40s, your 60s, or whatever. And you don't need to, maybe the right diet that helps you lose weight is really hard for you to maintain, but maybe you don't need to maintain it forever. Maybe you cycle into and out of it every couple of months or something like that. Those are all things I would think about. That is it. That was most of the questions, including all the ones I saw from paid subscribers.